Clear. The House is absolutely right to scrutinise this government over recruiting into our armed forces, and I welcome that because that enables me to be able to put pressure on our service chiefs. But I have explained, actually, whilst there were without doubt challenges to that capital contract, I've demonstrated already today how within this year itself we have already reached 70% of our target within the first 6 months. So that contract is now performing in a way that it wasn't before. And when it comes to medical standards, my right honourable friend is absolutely right, which is why there's a series of reviews at the moment about how we can prevent those injuries happening in the first place.
Mr. Speaker. Hey, Minister Wallace.
Mr. Speaker, happy Trafalgar Day. Mr. Speaker, with permission, may I group together question 2 and 22? Ships transiting the Strait of Hormuz are currently exposed to the threat of being harried by units of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards and, in some cases, illegal seizure. While the international community is working to de-escalate tensions, up to 4 ships of the Royal Navy have been active in the Strait since July.
Mr. John Barron.
Mr. Speaker, no matter how capable, a Royal Navy ship cannot be in 2 places at once. Is it not obvious that on this anniversary of the Battle of Trafalgar, and given that 95% of our trade is sea-borne, it is obvious we need a much larger surface fleet, and within that perhaps a larger number of cheaper ships if we are to play our full part in keeping world sea lanes open?
We're grateful.
I agree strongly with my honourable friend's point, which is why this government has invested in the new Type 26 frigate, but also the Type 31, which will be designed to be more affordable, that will increase our overall size of our frigates and destroyers able to deploy. But it is also the case that in this example, very quickly we managed to have 4 ships in that region at first to tackle that problem, and we have now gone back down to supplying 2 there, but it wasn't the case that we couldn't get ships in the right place at the right time.
Lord Blackman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my right honourable friend for his answers thus far. Clearly, the IRGC is a constant threat to shipping in the Straits of Hormuz. Does he not agree with me that it is now time that the entirety of the IRGC was prescribed, their assets sequestered, and indeed sanctions imposed on them and their leadership?
My honourable friend makes an important point about the threat that the IRGC is posing, not just to the region, but also to countries like ourselves. It is the fact that the Quds Force is currently prescribed. Further prescription considerations are a matter for the Home Office. However, what is really important is that where they pose a threat, like-minded countries around the world challenge that threat and make sure they are dealt with.
Stephen Pound.
Trafalgar Day has been mentioned, and later today, when Up Spirits is piped, and we all, I hope, drink a tot to the immortal memory. I hope that the Minister will place on record his recognition and understanding that the Royal Naval and Royal Marine personnel currently on active service represent the very finest tradition of our services. Let's put that on the record.
I'm, of course, delighted to agree with the honourable member about the amazing quality that they bring to our armed forces. I am a landlubber as a former soldier, so I can only marvel at what I have come across so far in this job.
Here, Griffith.
Very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. Well, happy Trafalgar Day. And yesterday I had the pleasure of seeing the Sea Cadets parade in an extremely splendid fashion for Trafalgar Day. Can I first welcome the Secretary of State and the new ministers to their posts. Now, the situation in the Strait of Hormuz and the wider Gulf has significantly escalated in the past few months. We've seen unlawful aggression in the international seas, British-flagged ships seized by the Iranian regime, attacks on Saudi oil facilities, and a recent commitment by the US to send an extra 3,000 troops to Saudi Arabia. But, Mr. Speaker, we need to de-escalate tensions. So with that in mind, can the Secretary of State confirm that the UK will not be sending troops to Saudi Arabia?
The Honourable Lady is absolutely right that we have to de-escalate this situation in the Gulf. What we will, however, do is make sure that our allies in the Gulf are able to protect themselves by offering advice about how they can protect their airspace and protect from loss of life. And I think that's incredibly important, that one of the ways to make sure this is de-escalated, Mr. Speaker, is to ensure that if there was another Iranian attack, for example, on an oil facility or any other facility in that part of the world, that it did not lead to loss of life, because I think that for sure would lead to some form of escalation. We stand ready to help our allies with knowledge on how to do that, and that is the best way we think we can proceed to keep the tensions calmer.
Neil Griffith.
I thank the Secretary of State for his answer. But, Mr. Speaker, the Secretary of State will also be well aware of the catastrophic impact of the US withdrawal from the Iranian nuclear deal. Sadly, this is not the only commitment that the Trump administration has very publicly undermined, withdrawing from the INF Treaty and putting the chances of a New START treaty in doubt. So what discussions has the Secretary of State had with his US counterparts on upholding and strengthening existing international security agreements?
On the JCPO, with dealing with Iranian nuclear capability, I have made clear, as have my other colleagues in Europe, to the United States, that we support the maintenance of that agreement. We think that is the best way forward to make sure that both Iran does not develop a nuclear weapon, but also deals with the concerns that the Iranians have had over years about their security. And we will continue to press that, as we continue to press in the areas of Turkey and Syria around the upholding of international law and human rights obligations.
The good doctor and the illustrious chair of the Select Committee on Defence, Dr. Julian Lewis.
I hope I get an extra long question in the light of that introduction, Mr. Speaker. May I take this opportunity for the first time to congratulate my right honourable friend on becoming Secretary of State for Defence? And may I return to the question of the tanker seizures and the point made by my honourable friend for Basildon and Billericay? Doesn't the fact that it was originally conceived that 32 frigates and destroyers would be necessary to complement the carrier strike forces and the amphibious forces mean that at 19 frigates and destroyers, the size of the escort fleet is woefully too small?
Minister.
Look, I look forward to working with my honourable friend. I think I'm in front of his committee later in the week, which will, no doubt, I shall bow to his knowledge, as he, no doubt, will grill me. Look, I understand the point that is made. All our defence capabilities have to match our ambitions. I think that is the first point across the board, whether that's land, sea or air. What is the case is that our fleet, our surface fleet, is over 50. Of course, 19 will be frigates and destroyers. And that means we do allow flexibility in our fleet to meet certain needs, such as disaster relief was done by a Royal Fleet Auxiliary ship. If, however, the threat changes, we must always be prepared to move to match that threat. We will always keep under review the size of our fleet, but it is also why we continue to invest in new ships, more capable sometimes in numbers because of the very potency they pose. The Type 26 frigate itself will be a world-leading capability, and that in itself will be a deterrent to many of our adversaries.
Andrew Jones.
Question 3, Mr. Speaker.
Minister Lancaster.
With permission, Mr. Speaker, I would like to take questions 3, 4, 5, 21 and 24 together. We remain committed to maintaining the overall size of the armed forces, and we have a range of measures underway to improve recruitment and retention. Those measures are kept under constant review. Importantly, the services continue to meet all their current operational commitments, keeping the country and its interests safe.
And Joan.
The Harrogate and Knaresborough constituency is proud home to the Army Foundation College, which has 1,100 junior soldiers in training. Last year, the college received an outstanding classification from Ofsted. Does my right honourable friend agree that the educational excellence on offer is a key part of the recruitment package for the college, and that the qualifications the junior soldiers receive set them up just not for their careers in the army, but for the whole of their lives?
Minister.
Well, I thank my honourable friend for being such a champion of this outstanding college, and he is absolutely correct. There's a multitude of excellent opportunities of which Defence and the Army are extremely proud, and these are reflected not just in terms of formal qualifications and apprenticeships, but also the self-esteem, confidence and leadership skills that they gain.
Halfon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In Harlow, we have outstanding cadet forces and outstanding cadet leadership. They provide the training that young people need and develop qualities of leadership. Can I ask my right honourable friend, what more can we be doing to support our cadet forces in Harlow and elsewhere to encourage young people into the services? And will he come and visit one of our great Harlow cadet forces?
Well, of course, how can I resist such a kind invitation? I'd be delighted to come and visit. Indeed, I started life as a cadet, so I know the value of it. But in accordance with the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, they are not conduits for entry into the armed forces. However, it is a fact that whilst just 4% of our cadet forces join the armed forces, some 20% of our armed forces were once a cadet.
Vicky Ford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Our cadet organisations give young people an invaluable insight into the potential of a future career in the armed forces, but they do need places to meet. I understand the MOD will help give financial support to buildings and other facilities for the Army and Air Cadets, but not to the Sea Cadets. So given that today is Trafalgar Day, will my right honourable friend meet with me to discuss how we can help to raise money for a new home for Chelmsford's excellent Sea Cadets?
Well, a training ship upholder in Chelmsford is indeed an excellent base for the Chelmsford Sea Cadets, and it is right that the Sea Cadets have a different funding formula than the other two services. They receive both a mix of funding from the MOD but also from other sources as well, and each of the Sea Cadet units is an individual charity. There's been much debate over the years as to whether or not that is the right way to move forward, but I'd be delighted to meet my honourable friend.
Sir Robert Sim.
The MOD in the past has done a number of bespoke packages to recruit people whose skills they need. For example, qualified doctors when the medical services have been short. Does the MOD intend to do more bespoke packages to get those with a range of skills into the armed services?
Well, my honourable friend raises a really interesting point, how as we move forward with the different specialist skill sets that we do need, for example, cyber is just one example, as well as medical services, as to whether or not we need to look at different models about how they can join the armed forces. And one of the areas that we are looking at is both greater use of the reserves for these specialist skills, but equally whether or not we should be having some form of lateral entry, as we already do with medical services.
How's Watling?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. For the last 2 years, I've been honoured to be part of the wonderful Armed Forces Parliamentary Scheme. I graduated only last week. Now, I've visited all three services, and they're engaging people doing amazing work to keep the peace and keep us safe. Overwhelmingly, they get great satisfaction and lead interesting lives. But I was shocked to hear that some universities are resistant to these terrific people visiting and advertising this unique career path to students. So I'd like to ask my right honourable friend, what more can be done to get our young people engaged with an armed forces career?
Of State.
Well, I'm very grateful for my honourable friend's comments about the Armed Forces Parliamentary Trust. Indeed, it's a scheme which many honourable and right honourable members in this House have benefited from. When it comes to young people, we are, of course, already the largest provider of apprenticeships in the UK, but also when it comes to encouraging university students to join, we have a burseship scheme, we have an undergraduate scheme. There's also, of course, the University Officer Training Corps and indeed the University Air Squadrons and University Royal Naval Units where undergraduates can participate.
Emma Dent Code.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question relates to the quality of living accommodation and local facilities on offer that make an army family life attractive. Could the Minister please update the House on the new £125 million leisure complex at Faslane Nuclear Base, dubbed the Super Mess, currently being dismantled to remove combustible materials?
Minister.
I think it's of note that it's normally family pressures which are the #1 reason why which members of the armed forces cite for leaving the armed forces, and that's why it's absolutely right that we do get this whole package correct. Faslane, as the honourable lady knows, will soon be the home of the entire submarine force for the Royal Navy. It has been the subject to a large amount of investment and has some of the best accommodation in the armed forces, but the mess itself has had challenges, and I will happily write to the honourable lady to update you exactly where we are on that issue.
The respected and celebrated President of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, Mrs Madeline Moon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. During visits with the NATO PA and indeed the Defence Select Committee to Finland, Norway and Sweden, I've noted their highly selective and competitive attempt to recruit young people into a national service scheme into the armed forces and government defence agencies. This is much sought after schemes in all countries and is highly effective at not only recruiting young people but retaining them into the reserves. Can I ask the Minister to look at Elizabeth Braw's excellent article on this in the Russie Journal, and can he look at this as an exemplar for the UK?
Well, Madam President, I'm grateful to your words of advice, and indeed I think it's a very constructive suggestion. I'm more than happy at looking at any way that we can encourage more people to join the armed forces, and crucially on the other side of the coin, which is to stay in the armed forces.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Traditionally, the North East provides a higher proportion of armed services personnel than any other region in England. Could the Minister confirm whether this is still the case following the recruitment shambles, and also set out the improvements to pay and housing that he will make so that the sacrifices of our armed forces are in the interest of the country and not of austerity?
Well, the Honourable Lady rightly highlights the important contribution that both the North East and the North West have made to recruiting to all three services over many years. I think equally it's fair to recognise that I'm determined that our armed forces should recognise modern Britain, which is why we are trying to encourage more members from the BAME community to join the armed forces, and equally more women. Currently, I think we're achieving 7.3% in the former and 12.2% in the latter. But last year, we saw a decent pay increase of some 2.9%, and we continue to invest an awful lot of money in improving the accommodation standards for our armed forces.
Mr. Speaker, can I first of all, Mr. Speaker, declare an interest, as my son-in-law will soon be going on active deployment with the reserves. Can I also point out the magnificent contribution of the reserve base in my own constituency in Carlton? Can I ask the Minister a simple question, but a really important question? The reserves are a crucial part of our armed forces personnel, and I know the Minister knows that, but there are real significant problems in recruiting and retaining reserves and integrating them into our armed forces. Can the Minister say a little bit more about what the government are doing about that?
The Honourable Gentleman makes a really important point. It will come as no surprise to him, as a serving reserve now for some 31 years, that I take reserve service very seriously. And I think the absolute key is to make sure that we maintain the offer. And that is one of the reasons why I have imposed a target to ensure that opportunity is there, and we will have at least 5% of our reserve community being given the opportunity to go on operations, as indeed the Right Honourable Gentleman's son is. And it's that offer which is so key.
MacDonald.
Congratulating the Minister on holding his position, I welcome the new team to the front bench. The Minister's boss is, of course, a Scot, and he will tell him that Scots don't take kindly to broken promises by Tory governments. So in the Scottish independence referendum, when a promise was made of 12,500 personnel in Scotland by 2020, at the last count standing south of 10,000, isn't it the case that that will be another broken promise by this Tory government?
Minister! Well, I'm sorry that the Honourable Gentleman doesn't seem to welcome the fact that Scotland will soon be the home of all of our Royal Naval submarine personnel. I'm sorry that the Honourable Gentleman doesn't recognise that there will continue to be an army brigade based in Scotland, and I'm sorry that the Honourable Gentleman doesn't seem to recognise the importance of Lossiemouth and the investment in Lossiemouth as there's the P8 soon to be based there.
Bambos Charalambos.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Question number 6.
Minister Anne-Marie Trevelyan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Ministry of Defence routinely monitors the performance of all contractors, including those who provide outsourced services. Performance against contract targets is regularly scrutinised, and officials take appropriate actions when standards are not met.
Bambos Charalambos.
Latest figures show that the Army is currently more than 9% under strength, and that the full-time trade-trained strength is now well below the government's stated target. It beggars belief that Capita still hold the contract for recruitment. So, can the Minister tell me, have the government just given up trying to hold them to account?
Minister.
I thank the Honourable Gentleman for the question, and I think I would refer him to the multiple answers that my colleague has just replied to.
James Gray.
Mr. Speaker, can I warmly welcome the Honourable Lady to her new post. She's very well deserved indeed. She's a graduate of the Armed Forces Parliamentary Scheme. That's where she learned everything, so I'm glad that she's now at the dispatch box. Mr. Speaker, I very much welcome the fact the new Type 31 is to be built in Rosyth. It should be a very good contract indeed. But what evidence does she have, or can she bring forward, that contract will be delivered on time and within budget?
Yes, and for the benefit of those observing our proceedings, so that they're intelligible, I think it ought to be explained that the honourable gentleman who's just asked the question is what might be described as the overlord, or the Gandalf figure who oversees the Armed Forces Parliamentary Scheme. Minister.
Mr. Speaker, your comments may go to his head. You know that, don't you? I thank my honourable friend for his question, and indeed it's been one of the most exciting things I've had the opportunity to do in this role so far, is to be able to set running the new Type 31 class of general purpose frigate. It will be built in Rosyth under Babcock's guidance, and the contract is just at the moment being drawn through to the final details so that we can hope to get cracking early in the new year.
Neil Griffith.
Well, I welcome again the new Minister to her post. But, Mr. Speaker, a report in the Financial Times today demonstrates that botched public sector outsourcing contracts wasted more than £14 billion worth of taxpayers' money in just the last 3 years, with the MOD found to be the biggest culprit, accounting for £4 billion worth of the extra cost. At a time when our defences are badly in need of investment after 9 years of Tory cuts, will the Minister accept that this government's ideological obsession with outsourcing is failing our armed forces and the taxpayer alike?
I thank the honourable lady for her question, and I have had a chance to look a little at the Reform think tank's paper, and it highlights some issues. I think all of us would agree that sometimes contracts have not always been managed as tightly as possible. I think I would direct her, most importantly, to the outsourcing review which was done by the Cabinet Office, set in place by the former Prime Minister in February of this year, which has been very clear and set some really good guidelines, I think, for all government departments to think more proactively about early market engagement in particular. I think that has been a weakness historically, and actually being much more active in management of contracts going forward, so that where we have great contracts like with Leidos, with a new contract I've just signed with Atos, some really great contracts, we make sure that we are responsible in the governance of those contracts so that we get the best for our money and that those contractors provide the service we need.
David Linden.
Indeed, Mr. Speaker, Capital's success in engaging with potential recruits has been particularly bad, and we see that with some of the bureaucratic aspects of the recruitment process and difficulty with the call centres. Does the Minister think this is really the appropriate way to go forward if we're serious about getting more folk into the armed forces?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch the start of his question, but in relation to call centres and Capita, I think we have to remember that those who are applying, who are, 16 and upwards, live in a digital world. They live on apps. Their world of actually dealing with those systems is very much part of that. The call centre is one part of the whole, and that service ensures that the young people can really ask those questions and get to grips with those initial questions about whether joining the armed forces is for them, and how that follows on from that is something that I think we'd all agree my colleague has spoken at length about this afternoon already. We are making huge progress in making sure that we get the numbers of armed forces we need.
Mr. Speaker.
Secretary of State.
Mr. Speaker, with permission, I would like to answer 7 and 17. We are committed to supporting the UK defence manufacturing industry. On the 14th of March, this government provided an update to Parliament on our ambitious Defence Prosperity Programme, which includes work to sustain an international, competitive and productive UK defence sector. In 2018, the MOD spent £18.9 billion with UK industry and commerce, directly supporting 115,000 jobs.
I thank the Minister for his response. But last week, the former head of MI6, Sir John Sawers, said that the deal for Cobham being taken over by Advent, the private equity company, should be blocked. The Business Secretary said that there would be guarantees, but we know in the case of GKN and Melrose, those guarantees were worthless. So if the US President can say that the US automotive industry is a concern that should be protected for national security, what sort of protections do we have in place for our industry?
We're grateful.
The honourable member makes a really important point about protecting our sovereign capability, and I take that incredibly seriously as someone who worked previously in Kinetic in the former the UK aerospace sector. The issue with Cobham, Mr. Speaker, is an ongoing matter. It is currently before the relevant department in Whitehall. We have made our internal submissions on that. I therefore cannot comment on that particular issue. It is important we maintain and keep our sovereignty where that is viewed as necessary for our future, but we should also not forget the reason we are the second biggest aerospace exporter in the world is because we take an international consortium attitude towards it.
Jim Cunningham.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Following on from the Minister's answer, can he tell us what the future value of contracts are to British companies like JKN and companies like Rolls-Royce? What's the future value? What's the future cost of these contracts?
Well, given we've had a recent increase in our settlement by £2.2 billion, of which a large proportion will go on investing in our capital part of our budget, the future for UK aerospace should be bright and looks bright because, of course, the Type 31 frigate, for example, is going to be made in Rosyth and is going to be delivered by UK yards.
Mark Francois.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Although the bulk of their work in the United Kingdom is civilian, Airbus Industries also do some military work, for instance on the A400M transport aircraft. Leaving aside the problems with that aircraft, which are dreadful and multifarious, more importantly, the current chief executive, Guillaume Faury, I think I pronounced that correctly, and his predecessor had both threatened to withdraw up to 14,000 jobs in the United Kingdom if we left without a deal and in a disorderly manner. Now that we have a deal and are not planning to leave in a disorderly manner, does the Secretary of State agree that the Chief Executive of Airbus should withdraw that threat and should start talking about investment?
My right honourable friend raises an interesting point. I think my only advice to Chief Executives of aerospace companies is where the skills are and where the customers are, and that is in the United Kingdom.
Although the order for the CVRT replacement, the Ajax tank was placed with General Dynamics, Lockheed Martin and Rheinmetall, the American and European companies, the hulls are being kitted out in Merthyr Tydfil and the turrets are being built in Bedford. How important does the Secretary of State believe that it is that if we place orders for the best equipment available in the free world, that we should have much UK content as possible?
Where possible, we should encourage and do as much as we can to make sure there is a huge proportion of UK content in all the contracts we deliver, if that is going to be possible, to make sure our forces get the kit they need.
Could I welcome the new ministers to their posts? Mr. Speaker, a little more than 3 months ago, a prominent Conservative member of this House said, and I quote exactly, "We must continue to hammer home the importance of sovereign capability." That was, of course, the new Minister for Defence Procurement before she was promoted. Thinking about the Fleet Solid Support Ships, for example, can I ask the Secretary of State why his ministers don't practice what they preach?
The honourable member is tempting me to comment on an ongoing competition, and he would know that if we were to prejudice that competition, both the UK taxpayer and indeed potentially UK industry would be put at risk by being sued by the other consortium. My honourable friend, who I welcome into my team, was of course not the minister at the time of that competition being delivered, so I think to hold her to that account is unfair.
Stephen Metcalfe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The UK has a... Oh, number 8, sorry.
Mr. Speaker, with permission, I would like to answer 8, 10 and 18 together. To help sustain future capabilities, we have published strategies for shipbuilding and combat air and refreshed our defence industrial policy with a new emphasis on supporting growth and competitiveness, which is central to our procurement programme, such as Type 31 frigate and Tempest.
Stephen Metcalfe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The UK has a world-beating defence industry that's dependent on high-value design. Can my right honourable friend therefore tell the House how his department is supporting the government's Engineering Take a Closer Look campaign to ensure that people understand how vital engineering is to our defence industry?
Can I congratulate my honourable friend for being appointed the engineering envoy by this government? I think engineering is incredibly important, and that's why we support the Engineering Take a Closer Look campaign to form part of that legacy and focuses on STEM youth engagement, targeting not only young people but also the gatekeepers such as teachers and parents. We're fully supportive of the campaign objectives, Mr. Speaker, to increase consideration of a career in engineering with specific focus on 11 to 16-year-olds, especially among underrepresented groups such as girls and BME.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What steps is the department taking to ensure key industries maintain sovereign capability?
In order to make sure that we keep skills and innovation here, the government has been determined to invest in that homegrown innovation, which I think is the best long-term way to sustain UK capability. That's why the Defence and Security Accelerator launched in 2016 is so important, as is the Defence Innovation Fund that has amounts to £800 million to be spent in that sector over the next 10 years.
Maria Miller.
Thousands of people across North Hampshire contribute to the defence of our country in companies like Fujitsu, Harris and BAE Systems and their supply chains. Being able to recruit experts from across the world to be able to work with our domestic homegrown talent is an essential part of our winning formula. How will the government make sure that that recruitment can still happen after we leave the EU?
My right honourable friend, the Home Secretary, has been very clear about a sort of points-based system to make sure that we get the skills we need. But again, the long-term solution is to invest in our skills base, which is why I was very pleased that at the recent spending review, the increase to FE funding is going to be so important to make sure that happens. In my constituency in Lancashire, that is the bedrock of BAE's capability. The investment in schools and higher and FE colleges makes the
Kevin Jones.
Here the Secretary of State reluctant to talk about the fleet sod support contract, but can I ask him what percentage of the bid is actually being taken into consideration in terms of support for UK jobs and manufacturing? And is he really going to be content with being the Secretary of State that is going to export jobs to Spain rather than invest in this country?
I think the right honourable member's last part is anticipating the result of any competition, and I'm not going to comment on who or what is going to win if we progress to that stage with competent bids. Look, it's going to be really important that all the bids coming forward will have an element of UK capability in them. We will make sure we look at that. It's really important to us and to the skills in this country that the customer, that is the MOD, spending all that money, make sure that it achieves not only an export market but also UK-based.
Ruth Smith.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Project Tempest is delivering and investing in a future fast jet programme. However, given what we're hearing about the potential closure of Brough, what conversations is the Secretary of State having with BAE Systems about replacement training jets, and what investment is he planning on making on for some new Red Arrows?
Oh dear. Mr. Speaker, I will have to write to you about the Red Arrows. It's not one I was expecting. Look, the Tempest is a very important sign that this government is committed to another generation of fast jet. That's a really important sign to BAE. I will be meeting BAE soon, and I will make sure that their desire to be part of this programme is reflected in where their workforce is around the country.
Get in there.
On the dispatch box made a very significant statement just a while ago when he said that companies should invest where the skills are and where the customers are. But that only applies if the customer's prepared to use their buying power to insist that that manufacturing takes place in the UK. So even before we come out of with Brexit, why won't he actually change government policy and actually insist that the solid ship support vessels are built in British yards? Make a decision, man.
Well, first of all, Mr. Speaker, the two aircraft carriers are built in British yards. The Type 26 is built in British yards. Type 45 is built in British yards. The Offshore Patrol Batch 2 is built in British yards. The Type 31 is built currently in British yards, and we will continue to invest in our yards. But as he heard from the previous member asking the question about how do we make sure BAE continues to invest in its workforce, the reason BAE could continue to invest in workforce because it also managed to export around the world. And when we export, we have to recognise we need international consortium because we cannot just sell purely to ourselves. We have to export around the world.
In there. Yes, Mr. Baker. Secretary of State.
Our armed forces have suffered decades of being hollowed out to meet short-term pressures. Eventually, this takes the toll on the men and women of the armed forces and the equipment and maintenance programme. The recent funding announced in the spending review will allow us to reinvest and maintain our forces at present levels. The adequacy of our capability is of course defined by the extent of our ambitions and whether we as a nation are willing to fund them.
Steve Baker. Grateful, Mr. Speaker, but will he reassure me that nothing in the European Union's coordinated annual review of defence will affect the capability or strength of our armed forces in the short, medium or long term as we leave the European Union?
My honourable friend raises some concerns about the engagement with Europe and indeed Europe's ambition. I think it is absolutely right that the European Commission has a very strong ambition for a single defence capability. We have been very clear that we will only join any part of this European defence voluntarily and on the condition there is a unilateral mechanism to exit. That is the key purpose of it. We will of course work with international partners often to face threats.
Martin Doherty-Hughes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If the Secretary of State wants to assess the strength of the armed forces, in his assessment, doesn't he now agree that it's about time that it had a trade union to stand up for ordinary members of the armed forces against his puny government?
Mr. Speaker, coming from a party who reduced the armed forces to a rubber boat in Scotland, I don't think we should really take any lectures from them. It's absolutely clear the SNP are obsessed with a trade union representation rather than investing in armed forces.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The 11, sorry.
11. Minister Johnny Mercer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've already met with the Schools Minister on this issue. Critically, we work hard to get the message out there through payslips, posters and an advertisement campaign. We can all, as MPs, play a role in making sure the families of those who serve receive the benefits they're entitled to.
Mr. Speaker, there are over 400 serving armed forces personnel in the Wakefield district that make a huge contribution to our nation's defence. But there are concerns from the Army Families Federation that the pupil premium, the service pupil premium, is not being used properly by schools to improve the pastoral outcomes for service children. What discussions has he had with schools on guidance?
Well, look, I'm very keen that the service pupil premium is used in the way that it's been designed for pastoral care and things like that. If the honourable lady has evidence that that is not taking the place, then I would invite her to write to me and we can look into it.
Edward Vasey. When the Minister next comes to visit the Royal Military College in Shrivenham in my constituency, will he pop into Watchfield Primary School, where he'll see a brilliant primary school educates children from all over the world, the children of the many nationalities that study at the Military Defence College? And when he gets back, will he ask the Secretary of State why the Ministry of Defence gives no financial help to this primary school in terms of the language teaching it has to do for these children?
Well, look, I pay tribute to the school in question that does a great job of looking after the children of those who come and serve on our CDS in Shrivenham, and I'm more than happy to look into the question he raises.
Danielle Rowley.
13, Mr. Speaker.
Minister Mercer.
17.
13. Number 13.
With permission, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to answer question 13 and 15 together. All service personnel with non-EU citizen dependents are subject to the minimum income requirement when applying for visas to enter the UK. I recently met with my friend, the Minister for Immigration, to discuss the minimum income requirement for visa fees. This is now being taken forward by officials from both departments, and I'm very hopeful of a good outcome.
Danielle Rowley.
Mr. Speaker, Pennycook in Midlothian is home to the Royal Highland Fusiliers at Glencorse Barracks, and the battalion have had a number of serving Commonwealth soldiers, particularly from Fiji, Mr. Speaker. Commonwealth citizens have made significant contributions to the defence of the UK throughout history and continue to do so today. I appreciate the warm words from the Minister and that he's had conversations, but isn't it time that we repay their sacrifice by scrapping the minimum income requirement so they can be reunited with their families?
So I pay tribute to the sacrifice and the service of those from Commonwealth countries over the years, which is exactly why we're looking to recruit more from those parts of the world as it stands at the moment. I am in conversations with the Home Office to try and work out ways that we can get over the minimum income requirement, and lots of options are being looked at, whether we work with credit unions to introduce it at pay slips and things like that. But I'm more than happy to meet with my honourable friend.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Much like ordinary civilians, Commonwealth soldiers are being unfairly treated by the government under its hostile environment policies. Is the Minister aware of the significant difficulties Commonwealth personnel have encountered in bringing their family to the UK, and will he engage with me to address these issues?
I'd be delighted to engage with my honourable friend, and I would reiterate again the sacrifice and the service of so many of our Commonwealth soldiers who've contributed so much to the armed forces in this country, make it such a diverse and incredible set of armed forces that do such a good job on our behalf.
When?
Number 14, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Defence exports will continue to be supported not just by Defence but by other government departments, including the Department for International Trade, after the UK leaves the EU. Work is ongoing to explore how to strengthen the competitiveness of UK industry and support exports, both to the EU and globally. My right honourable friend, the Defence Secretary, has regular conversations with the Secretary of State for International Trade, including through the Defence Security and Exports Working Group.
Harriet Baldwin.
Can I congratulate my honourable friend on her appointment and note that she is a fervent champion of the tremendous exporters that we have in the defence sector. She will know that they often face non-tariff barriers when they export to the United States. Can she reassure me that she will be championing their cause and making sure that those non-tariff barriers are broken down when we have a new trade deal?
I thank my honourable friend for her kind words, and I would reassure her that through our long-standing bilateral relationship with the US, we work closely across the full spectrum of defence, including on issues of shared economic interests such as reducing barriers. Free trade agreements are not used as a means of increasing defence exports. For non-sensitive and non-warlike defence goods and services, the UK may pursue greater access to US public procurement opportunities through the free trade agreement.
The 13 old nuclear submarines tied up alongside in Devonport not only provide a really important case to generate jobs in Devonport, but also exporting the skills and technology around the world. Will the Minister put forward a proposal and a strategy as to how we're going to recycle these old nuclear submarines within the next year?
I thank the honourable gentleman for his optimism that anything so big as a project as that could be done in a year, but I certainly take up the challenge, as I have been described by some of the department, poacher turned gamekeeper on this particular subject. Especially, I have made it very much a priority of my own to move it forwards. I was visiting the work being done on resolution on the Swift Shore project up in Rosyth just a couple of weeks ago, and I've been very encouraged